Well, on a slightly related point, I can understand the Irish Republican leadership in the south not knowing much about the north. But why was Irish republicanism in the north? Why was there not a North Longford in South Armagh? Why was it so quiescent throughout this period? Has any work been done on that?
Well, if I can mention that, I have a PhD student who's recently worked on this area, and it's funny you mentioned South Armagh. If there was one area outside Belfast City where the IRA was active, it was Frank Aiken's, what later became 4th Northern Division of Armagh, South Down, North Louth. Otherwise, why the IRA was not active, just lack of organisation, lack of people. So, as some of the suggestions I have mentioned there, lack of support within the community. A successful guerrilla organisation needs the tacit support of the community in which it operates. I think the realisation that they were a minority, and if they did resort to violent activity, the UVF would see to them fairly fast. I think that perhaps explains the lack of IRA activity really outside Belfast. And in fact, can you even describe what the IRA does in Belfast between 1920 and 1922 as part of the War of Independence? Are we looking at 3 different wars here? Are we looking at the Southern Irish War of Independence from 1919 to 1921, maybe an Ulster Civil War from 1920 to 22, and then the separate Irish Civil War? So I'm not even sure if you should include a lot of the violence in Ulster during 1920 and 1922 as part of what we would describe as the Irish War of Independence. So I don't know if any of my fellow speakers have any, or Eamon have any observations.
Well, I agree entirely. And just one supplementary point, as well as being a minority in northeast Ulster, greatly outnumbered by Ulster Unionists, nationalists in Ulster were different from nationalists in the rest of the country in their political loyalties. It's important to remember that the Parliamentary Party collapsed, crashed in ruins in Southern Ireland in December 1918, but it lived on as the dominant force in Northern Irish nationalism for another 50 years until 1970, until it was replaced by the SDLP. And the reason why it was stronger, the reason why Sinn Féin failed to make the sort of inroads in Ulster that it made in Munster, Leinster and Connaught, is that until 1918, the Home Rulers always faced a formidable opposition. Every election, by-election was contested. They had to have a fighting machine. They were experienced in gathering every vote. In the rest of the country, they became complacent. So many constituencies weren't contested time after time after time that they were ripe for the picking, for the plucking when Sinn Féin appeared on the scene in 1917 and 1918. So Sinn Féiners, let alone IRA men, would have been a minority among nationalists in much of what became Northern Ireland, as well as nationalists being a minority in the whole population.
You also see that particularly in the 1918 general election, and even Sinn Féin probably wouldn't have won the seats it won in what is now Northern Ireland if it wasn't for the electoral pact agreed with the mediation of the church leaders. But if you look in detail at the election campaigns in Ulster in 1918, constitutional nationalist supporters and voters are uneasy at Sinn Féin's abstentionist policy. There is a fear there among nationalist voters that if Sinn Féin abstains from Westminster, then the Irish representation there will be the Ulster Unionist and policies will be introduced, particularly relating to things like Catholic education and how it will affect Catholic education, which will damage nationalists. So that's another factor. There is genuine dissent at some of Sinn Féin's policies, and one of those policies which Northern nationalists were unhappy with was Sinn Féin's intention to abstain from Westminster.
And they were quite right.
Yes, the key point is just there, in terms of Northern nationalist reactions. For Northern nationalists in that whole period, 1914 to 22, the question was not one of home rule versus republic. It was really fear of partition. That's what drove the nationalist agenda. That's what explained why, in the spring of 1918, Sinn Féin won 3 by-elections in Ireland. One was won in Waterford, where Redmond had died, and it was a sympathy vote. But in the north, they won the South Armagh by-election in January, where they had a very good candidate in Pat McCartan, defeated by an AOH solicitor from Uri. And you had the East Tyrone by-election, where even the rhetoric of Countess Markievicz failed to prevent the Home Rule candidate Harbison being returned. And De Valera told a great story. The late Cardinal O'Fee told me this when I was working in archives in Armagh in the 70s. And he said that when he was president of Maynooth, he invited De Valera to tea. And De Valera said, "Where are you from?" And Cardinal O'Fee said, "Crossmaglen." And De Valera said, "I never want to hear the name of that place." And he says, "Why?" And he said, "Because during the South Armagh by-election, De Valera had arrived in the main square in Crossmaglen in support of the Sinn Féin candidate on a bleak winter's evening in January 1918. And there were it was a Hibernian town, supporters of Wee Joe Devlin. And they were all hanging around the pubs and shops. And as De Valera came in, he came in on a break, sort of dressed a bit like Roddy McCauley with a long black cloak, surrounded by pikemen. And a few roughnecks burst forward, grabbed a pike and thrust it through the side of the break. And it punctured De Valera in the side. And he was rushed off to Newry Infirmary. Now imagine that the course of Irish history had De Valera bitten the dust in Crossmaglen Main Square at Hibernian hands as Sinn Féin was taking off in 1918.